I am Tom McTague. I am the editor-in-chief of the New Statesman magazine and the author of a recent book called Between the Waves, The Hidden History of a Very British Revolution, which I think we're going to try and focus on tonight. I began working on it quite a while ago now. I think it was about 4 years in the making, in total. And I think sort of to give you a background of how I came to write the book and how I came to write it in the way that I did, you might find it interesting to sort of go back to the genesis of it, really. And at the time, when I first started thinking about it, was working for a company called Politico. I'd been working in what I thought was my dream job at the Independent on Sunday. I'd been made political editor there, and it was actually the newspaper that I first joined as a journalist. I was a sort of lowly graphics researcher at the time, and then I'd recycled sort of through lots of different organizations, and then ended up back at the Independent on Sunday as political editor. And then 4 months after I joined, the newspaper literally shut on me. And that was not long after the Brexit revolution, actually, and Brexit referendum. And I had interviewed David Cameron in one of my last acts as political editor for the Independent. And I remember thinking at the time, just sort of being bowled over by what had happened, had not expected it, had kind of got an understanding of David Cameron's panic, and the point of him giving me the interview, one of my last editions there, if not the last, I think actually, was to try and drum up support among younger voters, to warn younger voters that the result wasn't in the bag and that they needed to turn out. And so that was the kind of background, and then the loss of the job. And I ended up, and it was strangely one of the sort of the best things that happened to me, because I ended up at a place called Politico, which is an American organization based in Brussels. Or the American organization is based in Washington, but they had a spin-off called Politico Europe based in Brussels with an operation in London. And it was fantastic for me because it was my first experience of working for an American organization, which has a very different kind of set of media rules, if you like. It's a very different journalistic culture. They sort of think in a very different way. They have different standards, higher standards when it comes to sourcing and things like that. And they have a sort of premium on getting your own scoops, getting your own understanding, your own pieces of work, rather than what is quite common in Fleet Street, or was when I was working in newspapers, which was to, so cover yourself, make sure you've got every angle covered from what everybody else is doing, follow the pack. Which I would often see when going to these European summits as part of the traveling Westminster pack. And so I ended up Politico, and it was there that I really started to get an expertise about Europe, and spending a lot of time in Brussels and spending a lot of time with the British pack that were based in the EU, and seeing from their perspective the stories that I had previously been covering as a Westminster lobby journalist. And then it was that kind of sense of going back and forth between Brussels and Westminster and seeing from both sides the negotiations that were then happening, the Brexit negotiations to leave the EU, that I just started getting completely fascinated in, and dominating my life really as the kind of chief political correspondent for this Brussels-based American news organization with bases in London and in Brussels, and still working out of the lobby in Westminster. It just kind of gave me this complete overview of what was going on, or it felt like it did at the time. And yeah, that dominated my life really for the next 3 years, until I moved to another American organization called The Atlantic, which was uh, a real moment for me in my career because the Atlantic, the standards that I'd learned at Politico were then sort of raised even higher at the Atlantic, where the demands of what a magazine piece there what they were was so much higher, and the you know they what you had to deliver was so much higher. But the freedom was fantastic to be able to write about the characters in British politics, like Boris Johnson and others. So it was all of that kind of combination that came together. And I was reading quite a bit at the time, and there was two books I would cite as being quite influential to me in forming my thoughts about Between the Waves. One was a book called by Rick Perlstein, an American journalist who writes a lot about the American conservative revolution. And there are a series of books, one called Nixon Land, there's Reagan Land. And the original in this series is called Before the Storm. And it tells the story of the 1964 presidential election, uh, in which the Republican Party nominated a kind of conservative ideologue called Barry Goldwater to as its candidate to go up against Lyndon Johnson. And it was the first time that the Republican Party had nominated a ideological conservative, a kind of radical at its heart. And he went on to this landslide defeat against LBJ. And all of the American magazines and newspapers at the time wrote, or there was a kind of generally accepted consensus that if the Republican Party decided to become a conservative party ideologically in the States, because remember at that time, both the Democrats and the Republicans had both liberal and conservative wings. It was a very kind of strange setup. Um, that if they did that, if they became a conservative party in the kind of Goldwater style, they would never win power in America again. And that was the kind of the consensus. And Perlstein quotes from grand titles like the Atlantic or the New York Times making this case. And then the arc of the story that he tells is how wrong that analysis was, and that state after state started to fall to conservatives in the likeness of Barry Goldwater. So they started to win in southern and western states, like Arizona, where Barry Goldwater is from, until Ronald Reagan wins California. And then, of course, Ronald Reagan wins the presidency. And really, the arc of Perlstein's story finishes in 1992, and his argument being that Bill Clinton effectively sues for peace and says, "Okay, we accept the basic tenets of your conservative revolution." And so, in a sense, it was this story of how a movement which had been heavily beaten in an election would go on to triumph against all the kind of conventional wisdom. And I could not help but read this story in the atmosphere of Britain at the time that I was reading it, and think of the Eurosceptics, and think of moments in my life where the idea of Euroscepticism triumphing uh, in any way would have been absurd. But to have triumphed in the way that it did, to have won the referendum, and then not only that, but then won that kind of subsequent battle between 2016 and 2019, where it ends up with a hard Brexit and the sort of crushing of the Conservative Party's moderate wing, the crushing of sort of everyone, it seemed at the time when I was thinking about it in sort of late 2019, 2020, after that Boris Johnson general election victory, that just would have seemed completely wild to the young me who was looking at politics in 1997, or even in the early 2000s when Blair was utterly dominant and Euroscepticism was seen as kind of cranky and old-fashioned, sort of anachronistic. And it almost by definition, a kind of sign that the Conservative Party wasn't serious, that it was about winning power at least. Um, and so that was a kind of frame that I couldn't get out of my mind, that sense that here were these people who kept losing. Remember that phrase, the sort of fruitcakes and loonies, you know, who kept losing and losing and losing and losing until they won. And that sort of made me think about how history works, in that sense that history doesn't work in these sort of clear, linear lines. It doesn't it doesn't follow a clear, predictable process that you can see and you can outline in the way that I think a lot of the talk, if you go back to the early 2000s, a lot of how we talk about politics and how we talk about history is framed in that kind of analysis, that there is a kind of inevitability about where things are going, and that if you believe in something different to that inevitability, that you're just going to be crushed by the logic of history. And actually, history seems to work in a much more kind of chaotic fashion, which is dependent on events and personalities and forces beyond our control, and often forces we can't see when we're in the moment. And you can only start to become clear when you pull the camera back. And the second book that was really influential to me, when I was thinking about this book, was an excellent book, which many of you may have read, um, called This Blessed Plot by Hugo Young, a former Guardian journalist, a late Guardian journalist who died. And it is an absolutely tremendous book, and it's about the history of Britain in Europe. And it tells a story that is quite, although he's a, a very strong supporter of British membership of Euro. It tells a story that is quite difficult for pro-Europeans, and was actually well received by Eurosceptics at the time, because it told a story that, in a sense, Britain had never been honest enough about what Europe, the EU, the EEC, had meant from the beginning, and that it was a noble project after the war to bring the countries of Europe together in a federal Europe, and that this had been always kind of hidden from the British public, by governments and by political leaders who were too cowardly, really, in a sense, to make the case for Europe, and why that this was, in Hugo's view, an inevitable future. Um, and the thing that really jumped out to me about that was, if you combine it with the Pearlstein analysis, what Hugo is saying, absolute clarity and brilliant reporting, going back and speaking to all of the people who were involved in all of the negotiations going right back to 1945. He tells the story brilliantly. But his frame, when you read it in 2019, you read the introduction where he says that Britain's future belongs in Europe, a conclusion that is proven by the fact of our membership of the EU. So it was a kind of circular argument which argued that, the very fact that we were in the EU proved that all of that sort of hassle that we'd gone through, all the silly Eurosceptic back and forward in the 1990s and in the 80s, all the arguments in the 70s and the 60s about should we go in or should we not go in, the referendum, um, debates about Maastricht, all of that was kind of froth and noise, because it sort of it didn't deal with the fact that we would inevitably be in. And once we were in, and that kind of inevitability was proven by the fact of our membership. Now, of course, if that's the argument, the very fact that we're no longer in Europe suggests that that argument falls down. Now, of course, you can then say, well, um, the fundamentals of his analysis will be proven in the long run when we re-enter the single market or the customs union, or then when we go back into the EU itself in some form in the future. But the way he argued it, by using the fact that we were members as proof of the sort of the purposelessness of the arguments kind of fell away. It felt old-fashioned. It felt anachronistic having read it. And so it seemed to me that there was a kind of updated version to be done about this story, building on what Hugo Young had said, but with the knowledge that we had not resolved the conundrum as we thought. We'd actually left something that was hard to imagine. And so from that point, I started to think about, well, where is the starting point to tell this story, to tell this kind of the story of how the losers of history had somehow found a way to win, at least in the short term. And I thought about the year 2000 as an obvious beginning, perhaps think about it as a 21st century story. And then I thought really 1997 was an obvious moment where you had newspaper headlines very similar to the newspaper headlines in the United States in 64, saying, is the Conservative Party finished? Is it over? Will it ever be elected again? And the Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party having completely lost their power. You remember how powerful they were in that uh, uh, period of time under John Major after his election victory in 1992. How they held the balance of power in the Conservative Party in Parliament, and they used it to cause him such problems. Suddenly, with Blair's landslide, they were gone. They were powerless, and they looked out of date. And the modernisation project of the Conservative Party began. And in a sense, it was modernising by moving away from Margaret Thatcher. That perhaps that was a good place to start. And then I thought, God, it doesn't feel quite right. You can't quite tell the story of Maastricht and all of that. You have to be able to tell that story. And then I ended up in 1990. I thought that was a good place to start because it's sort of the fall of Margaret Thatcher, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Soviet Union, and sort of the end of the Cold War. You could kind of time it to 1990, the beginning of a new world. And then I thought you had to tell the story of the Bruges speech, this defining moment that sets up so much of the Eurosceptic cause. That's in 1988. Sure, I can't start in 1990 because of that. And this process of kind of, I can't do that because I've got to tell that story of what happened before, sort of just kept going back and back and back. And I sort of went through the Single Market Act in 1986, or the first referendum in 1975, joining in 1973, the vote to join in 1971. And then you've got these kind of defining moments in the 60s, the application to join and the rejection by de Gaulle, Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, which sort of inserts immigration into British politics, which is obviously crucial in the Brexit referendum. All of these moments took me into the 60s and the characters that would flow throughout the book. And once I was there, I thought, really, I've got to follow Hugo Young and start in 1945, and then in the beginnings of the European coal and steel community in 1950, and tell that story from the beginning and the beginning of the EC in 1958 with the Treaty of Rome. You've got to tell it all. All of it's important, and that this overriding importance of Britain as a victorious power in 1945, but which had lost its power as a global superpower and very quickly would lose the empire. That is so central to the story. That's so central to the psychology of the country that you have to tell it. And also, of course, the psychology and the national instincts of France and Germany in 1945 are so central. And it was at this point that I came to I discovered really a time and a place where four of the kind of great characters of my book and of the European story happened to be in the same place at the same time. And it was so remarkable to me, this coincidence. And so kind of so perfect as a starting point, as a sort of genesis of the story that's where I decided to start. And it's in a city called Algiers in Algeria, of all places. And there at the same time are these four men that I mentioned. There's uh, Jean Monnet, the founding father of Europe, who at the time was in the pay of the British civil service. He is in effect a British civil servant who had been close to Churchill and had moved to Washington and had become working for the Allies, and become very close to Roosevelt. And he was the trusted Anglo-American fixer who could be sent into North Africa to deal with a big political problem that had emerged for Britain and America, and that was what to do about France. And the Americans had their candidate to take over, and we had ours. And ours was Charles de Gaulle. And so Charles de Gaulle flies in. Jean Monnet flies in from America. The Americans sent in their man, a guy called Robert Murphy. And Britain needs its equivalent political fixer for Churchill. And so Harold Macmillan is sent in. And so, in the same place at the same time, trying to figure out the future of France is Harold Macmillan, the man who would make Britain's first application to join the European community. That was the brainchild of Jean Monnet, who was there with him. And together they were trying to help solve a political problem about the future direction of France, of which Charles de Gaulle would emerge as the victor and the man who would reject Britain's application to join the European community, all there at the same time in the same city. And across town, working for British intelligence in Algiers at the same time, was the founding father of Euroscepticism, and that was Enoch Powell. And they were all there at the same time. And I thought this was just such a remarkable coincidence, a remarkable moment where, the founding father of Europe, the founding father of Euroscepticism, the first British prime minister to see Britain's future in Europe, and the first French president to reject that, all there. And they're all kind of operating in the same theatre. And so that was the beginning of the story. And I tell the story from then on in three parts, really. One from 43 stroke 45 up until 1975 and the referendum. That is the kind of the building of a new consensus. And then from 75 to 1997 and the formation of what seems to be a kind of new consensus again. You go into the great battles over Europe in the 1990s, which then appear to be settled. And in 1997, with the election of Tony Blair, the most pro-European prime minister since Heath, and then suddenly the death of Enoch Powell a few months later, that seems to settle with a consensus. And then the final third of the book, which is 1997 through to 2016. And so that's the story.